When you work with a large spreadsheet, sometimes after you have worked with putting in data and you have so many rows and columns, you realize that while you have all those rows and columns, what you have amounts to raw data. You don't have any totals, you haven't sorted or filtered or done anything to make that information helpful and useful to those who actually wanted that spreadsheet in the first place. Well, one of the things that you can do to very easily, without really writing formulas and functions and sorting and filtering, is to use a pivot table. Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library, and today we are going to look at pivot tables in Google Sheets. Looking at this example today, I can see that we have here a collection of movie DVDs. And as we look at row 1, we can see that it has movie title, genre, starring actors, and the year that the movie was made. Before we create our pivot table, I do want to add in a slight warning, and that is this. When we create a pivot table, we need to have some sort of goal in mind. What are we really trying to accomplish when we create the pivot table? Otherwise, we can start with guessing where we want to go and then kind of adding to that and then adding to that, and all of a sudden we've created all sorts of really clever things, but maybe they have nothing to do with that original goal. So be careful, because pivot tables kind of draw you in and are highly addictive, and you can spend a lot of time playing with what if. So let's start with some goals in mind as we work with our pivot table. There are some things that we want to consider before we even start creating a pivot table. So first of all, we have very few columns here, only 4, and all of these columns have very unique headings. Now, when you have a really large spreadsheet, it is very common or very easy to see something like a customer's name and address and phone number, and then say their company's name, address, and phone number. All sorts of potential for having the same exact column headings running across the top. What you want to do then is differentiate each one of those column headings so that they are all unique. So for example, you might put C dash and then put name for a customer name. Now, along with that, you always want to make sure that your data is as complete as possible. And as I look at column D, which is the end of my data here, it is in fact absolutely complete, which is very helpful, as is the last row here in row 59. There is something in each one of those cells. You also, besides having as complete information as possible, you want to be sure that the area of the data that you want to use for your pivot table is separated from anything else that might be on that sheet. So here, as I look at row 60, notice that it is blank. As I look at column E, notice that it is also blank, which really separates out my list from any of the rest of this sheet. And that is so helpful then in creating your pivot table and making sure that there isn't any confusion of what should be included. To create our pivot table, I'm going to go up to Insert in the menu bar, which is the 4th choice, and I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to come down to the second section of that drop-down and select Pivot Table. Because I was clicked in the data that I have, it has already picked up that the data range is A1 through D59, which is correct. And that's also partially because I have that blank row and blank column that surround my data. Otherwise, I could very easily wind up needing to type in a correction to that data range. Now, I can also decide if I want to add this pivot table to a new sheet or to an existing sheet. Some of that might depend on how large you think your pivot table is going to end up, but we will just go with the default of New Sheet, and then down at the bottom right, we're going to click Create. And here we have the beginnings of our pivot table. Notice that starting in A1, we have essentially a chalk line of where that pivot table is going to reside. And it's even started with A2 where it says rows. So we need to decide what's going to be in the rows. And then in B, it even suggests that that's where if we add in information that we think should go into columns, that will go there. And then values, sometimes values are text values, names, for example. Or it could be, well, values, so numbers of some kind. So it's very similar to a spreadsheet in that general idea of rows go across, columns go down, and then the values are in the cells that intercept those rows and columns. Over on the right, we have the pivot table editor, and we have all sorts of options here. So let's just look at this briefly. First of all, we can turn it off. So on the right of where it says pivot table editor, we can click on the X and close out that particular pane. Now to get it back, I can go over to the left where there is an edit button. And when I click on the edit button, it brings back our pivot table editor. Below pivot table editor, we can see that it is once again defining the size of the data that we are summarizing in our pivot table. And then below that, we have some suggested pivot tables that we might want to use. And then below that, we have a way to manually create or add to some of those suggested pivot tables by adding in rows, columns, values, and filters. To the right, we can look for movie titles, genre, starring actors, and year made, which are the 4 column headings that we have in our spreadsheet. Let's start by looking at the 3 suggested pivot tables first. So we'll start with count of movie title for each genre, and we can click on that. And then over at the left, we have the genre, and notice that the genre is in alphabetical order. I did no sorting myself. It just simply took all of the genres as it looked at all of the different rows and combined them, counted them, and alphabetized them. And so we have here action, and we have a count of the action movies that is 8. Animation, we have 14. Fantasy, we have 3. Romantic comedy, we have 4, for example. And it's added in a grand total row in row 11 that says overall there are 58 movies that we have in our collection. Notice also that in B1 it says count A of the movie titles. Count A counts text, or really non-numeric values. So it looked at the movie titles, and every time it saw a movie title, it counted that movie title as 1. So as it went through and it was looking at all of the action genre movies. It counted each movie title and came up with 8. And we can even see that as I come over to the right, that this has changed here under suggested just a little bit. And it says that, all right, you chose genre as the main topic here. And the order is ascending, although we could also add in descending. And we want to sort by genre, although we could have also selected count A of movie title. Now, let me click on that just so you can see that what it's going to do is change our pivot table so fast, so dramatically. And now with count A of movie title, we have the amounts of the different genres in ascending order. Well, let's go back to sort by, and we'll put genre here. So again, for genre, we have action, animation, comedy. We also have the checkbox here for show totals, and we could uncheck it if we want to. Let me do that to show you. And so, yeah, now we don't have any totals showing in row 11. I kind of like to have them on just to make sure that all 58 of those movies are represented. That was pretty easy, wasn't it? And then as I scrolled down, it's saying, well, not only did we look at the genre, but we also looked at the movie title. And we summarized by count A. There really wouldn't be a way to come up with a sum because we have no numbers to add. So about the best choice of all of these default functions that you can use with a pivot table is count A when we have text. Now we could also show this as percent of the row, percent of the column, percent of grand total. Because of the math involved and because we're using count, percent of column and percent of grand total are going to be the exact same number. But let me show you how this works. So we have our genres here, and let's just look at action. And right now we know that that is 8 out of 58. And so let's go to percent of row. And yes, that would only make sense that I have 8 of 8, that's 100%. And however many animations were, well, it was, I don't know, 4 out of 4, 100%, etc. So that really didn't help us with any kind of valuable information. Let's look at percent of column. We're looking at the grand total being 100%, but we can see how the genres, the count of each one of those genres, takes place and adds up to 100%. So action is almost 14%, animation is 24%, family is 15%, and it helps us see what the distribution is then by the percentage. And again, the grand total is 100%. Well, we'll go back to show as and just go to default, where we see the true numbers and the count A of the different genres and the movie titles within those genres. Now let's go back and look at the other two kinds of pivot tables that have been suggested for us. So we'll go to suggested, and where we have the down caret, the down arrow, we'll click on that, and let's look at number of unique starring actors for each year made. And it's going to do some sort of a count again. Well, let's click on that. And so for the unique starring actors, my guess is if there's are zeros, that means it was some sort of animation. And the other thing is you might have Tom Hanks by himself in a movie. That would be a unique value. But if you have Meg Ryan, comma, Tom Hanks, that would count as one unique value. It wouldn't count as 2 for Tom Hanks. So kind of keep that in mind. But again, we have the year made and then the unique values. Now, there are only 40 unique actors in those 58 movies. Again, we have all sorts of options on the right here where we could change this from ascending to descending order. We could sort by year made or by the starring actors, the count of those actors, and we could summarize by the unique actors. The default, of course, is just the number as opposed to 8%. Well, let's go back to suggested and look at the number of unique starring actors for each genre as opposed for each year. So we'll click on number of unique starring actors. And so now we have the different genres and how many different unique actors there are. Well, again, there are 40, but it just splits it out according to the genre as opposed to the year. I've moved us back to our example spreadsheet, and let's see how it would look if we created pivot tables just on our own. So again, I have clicked in the spreadsheet that has all of my information, and I'm going to go to Insert and Pivot Table, and it's picked up the correct data range, and we're going to go to a new sheet and Create. We get a chalk line here starting at A1 and ending at E10, although that can certainly be changed. But now, as we go to the right, instead of going to Suggested, we're going to come down to Rows. To the right of Rows, we can click on Add. And what do we want to add? Well, we're going to just start with genre, which is something that we've seen with this suggested pivot table. So let's start with that. We'll click on genre. And then we need to determine, do we want to make this ascending or descending? We'll keep it ascending. Do we want to show totals? Well, yes, we do. And how do we want to sort? Well, I think we want to sort by genre. So this is how our pivot table is starting out. It just has an alphabetical list of all of the genres. Well, I'd also like to find out how many movies I have in a particular genre. So where it says values, we're going to add, and I'm going to select genre as well. Now this is really interesting. It's looking at the records that are in my spreadsheet. It has counted the number of times that the particular genre has shown up in my spreadsheet. Action is 8, animation 14, drama 10, etc. Now here's something to keep in mind. If I select Add Values and the field has text information in it, Sheets will count the values. If I go to Add Values and the field has numeric information, it's going to try to sum or in some way add those particular numbers. Well, genre has text values, so it's going to show count A, and it counts the text. This is where creating a pivot table can be really fun and where you start asking, well, what else can I do? And this is where we have to be careful that we don't go crazy. But what if I'd like to add the years the movies were made? Well, I can go to Add Columns, and what do I want to add? Year made. Now you'll notice that I had 4 column titles. One is already being used, genre, so it's not in this list. And so now I can come down to year made. And as I look, it has 1941, 1950, 51, 61, 75, etc. I'm going to close out of our pivot table editor just so we can see this a little bit easier. And I think I'm going to try to select these columns and make them a little smaller so it's easier to read. But notice how far out it goes. It goes clear to AE. And then let's see if we can't narrow those down. And that's a little better. So as I look at this, I can see where, for example, animation was made. And there was one made in 1941, another one in 1950. here in 1961 there was an animation made, but there was also a musical. And down in row 12, it shows me that 2 movies were made that year, different genres. As we come to 1981, 2 movies created that year. 2 movies here in 1983 that were of the same genre. Here I have 3 that were made, and here's another one that was 3. Let's see, 2 action and 1 animation. 4, so we have 3, I think that's comedy, and 1 of animation. And we can go through and look at all of the information that I am getting, where I don't have to manually count, I don't have to write any kind of a formula, but it tells me quite a bit about this particular spreadsheet that I have. And then in AE, I get the grand total, and these numbers should look familiar, right? 8, 14, 6, 10, but it tells me that I have in row 12, AE 12, that we have 58 total movie titles. And wow, how hard was that? Pivot tables are just amazing. I may decide that even though I can make it fit on a legal size piece of paper, it just seems kind of like too wide and not tall enough, and I'd like to represent my data in some other way. So I'm going to go back to the Edit button, and this time I may decide to just remove the year made because it's too wide, but let's add movie titles below genre. So let's see, in the rows we have genre. Let's click on Add and add in movie titles. And now they're all showing, and this is really great. It still has that year made though, so we may want to consider that a little bit. We can even add the starring actors by selecting rows and add, and then starring actors. And notice how the row information is filling in the order that I'm adding these particular choices. Well, to remove the actors and the movie titles, we can click the X to close and remove the starring actors and the movie title, kind of get back to where we were. But remember, I don't really like how wide this is, so this is where it gets really interesting. We can pivot this table by putting the year made in rows and not the columns. And all I have to do, well, there's 2 ways. I can either go to Add and add in the year made, or I can simply click year made and go up under genre, for example. And so now I have the genre, but then after that we have the year made. Now we still have the count of the genre as we go to the right. And so in this way, pivot tables kind of differ from spreadsheets in that even though I said I wanted to have genre as a row and year made, this is almost more like a sort where I have the genre and then I have the year made in a new column, and it's all in rows. And then because that kind of got pushed into column B, then the count got moved over to a new column as well. Well, this is where it gets even more fun. We can trade genre and year made. And again, all I have to do is click on year made, and it becomes like its own little button, and I can just simply drag it up above genre. So now we have year made, and we have the genre, and we still have the count of the genre. I can also drag genre below columns. So instead of having it as a row, I can drag it below columns instead of using the Add button. And now I have a totally different look, and I kind of like this look. Now I have the year made, I have the genre running across the top, and then I have a total of each genre per year, And it's all very much more compact as I'm getting those totals in column K. Still have a grand total here in row 32, and I still have 58 movies represented. Sometimes how you think a pivot table may look might be a little off, and so sometimes it's really a great thing to be able to simply move these around to the different rows and columns until you can get a look that you really like and that still fairly represents your data. And so we now have year made as the rows, and in the columns we have the genre, and the values are also the genre. But what a nice difference this makes. Even though I really like the way this pivot table is looking, I might decide that I need to filter some of the information. I don't want to know about all of the 58 movies. I only want to look at a certain section of them. So what I can do is come over to my pivot table editor, and as I scroll down below rows and columns and values, I can also look at filters. So let's quickly add a filter. For example, I might select year made in the filter box here. And then once it appears, the status says right now it's showing all items, but I can click the drop down and I could select a particular value here, take off some of the check boxes that appear because all of the years are represented. Instead of filtering by values, though, I'm going to filter by condition. When I click filter by condition, I can click on these arrows on the right, and I get an amazing amount of choices. So I can look for the years that are not empty or that are empty, the text contains or doesn't contain, starts with or ends with, the text is exactly. So all those are kind of text fields. Then there is a section about dates. The date is, it's before or after. And then I can do kind of just more strictly math, I guess, where we have greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, is equal to, not equal to, is between or not between. We're going to select is between. Then it even shows up here in the text box. And I type in my first value, let's say 1981, and the ending value, I think, is 1998. And then down at the bottom right, I can click on OK. And I have only the movies that were made between 1981 and 1998. To turn that filter off, all I need to do is go back to the X and click on it, and I have my entire pivot table yet again. We have just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg when it comes to pivot tables, but I know it's something that you will want to play with and enjoy. Don't forget that you can always undo if you get, well, drawn into the world of pivot tables and maybe go a little far. So you can always undo and fix anything that kind of blows up on you. But pivot tables are such a wonderful, wonderful tool when you need to summarize information and understand what a spreadsheet is telling you. To learn even more, be sure to go to mymcpl.org/online learning for such great resources as Universal Class, Learning Express Library, LinkedIn Learning, and Udemy Business. We also premiere videos every Wednesday and Friday at 1 o'clock. If you miss a video premiere, you'll still be able to find it later when it's convenient for you. You can find us on Facebook at MCPL 360 And you can find us on YouTube by going to our MCPL MO channel.